So please feel free again to get up and go to the bathroom, get refreshments. We want to be very informal, right? So we want this to be about us coming together to engage, and so I know you need to get out, take calls, feel free to do that. But I want to introduce our next panel, Collective Actions, the Social Dimensions of Climate Resilience. Our 5 panelists will be describing holistic approaches from coastal Virginia to southern Appalachia that put communities at the center of climate justice and climate resilience. We'll kick off our panel with our inaugural university fellow, Liz Ogbu. So we were fortunate enough, President Ryan kicked off a new university fellowship program. We have anywhere between 2 to 3 fellows a year across grounds, and we are fortunate enough to get a fellow this year, Liz Ogbu, as our university inaugural fellow. So, Liz, the stage is yours. You want to come on up?
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? Good, good. Thank you so much for welcoming me here as part of this. I'm excited to be here. I've been coming back and forth to Charlottesville for many years, and so it feels great to be able to do so in this capacity now. And I'm excited to be on a panel with some amazing folks. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that's supposed to happen over the course of the next couple of days. I thought what I'd do is just share a little bit about my work. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm trained as an architect. I'm actually based out of California, which is experiencing its many atmospheric rivers at this point. So I feel like this conversation of climate is very central to what I do. I'm trained as an architect, and I have run for many years a design consultancy called Studio O that operates at the intersection of racial and spatial justice. And so what I wanted to do today is talk to you about both this larger lens of how I think about the issues that we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days, but also to talk about like how in particular I feel like that intersects with the issues that I'm working on every day. So, when I used to be asked to do presentations at conferences or symposium or conversations that were supposed to have happening around sustainability, I often would share this image, which is from an abandoned library in Camden, New Jersey. And oftentimes, especially when I first started out 15, 20 years ago, that this conversation about what is sustainability that often would be defined in environmental terms. How do we, save the natural resources, which is important, but I would sort of argue that if we divorce people from that part of it, that this would be seen as a success story, right? Like there's a verdant landscape growing there, but I don't think any of us would agree that this is a success story. And so for me, the question is, how do we talk about both creating opportunities and transformations that not only save the earth and save all of those natural beings that live in that landscape, but how do we also do something that nurtures people and community as well? So for me, the lens at which I start to operate around this is spatial justice. And for those of you who are not familiar with this term, it was coined by geographers. And it basically means that justice has a geography and that the equitable access and distribution of services, outcomes, should be a basic human right. And I would even argue that it's not just outcomes, but also opportunities. And so we know that when we look at a lot of cities, we can see examples of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. From which neighborhoods wind up with the industrial uses versus the gleaming office towers, which ones get insufficient bus routes versus multi-million-dollar transit centers, which ones get a plethora of vacant lots versus the nice parks. And this is something that you can find in almost any city across the country, this disparity of conditions. And so spatial justice, oftentimes it's like, okay, justice in space, but the reality is if we were to overlay demographics to all of those images that I showed, we would find that there is actually an intersection between racial and social justice. Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the poor historically wind up in places where there is a lack of spatial justice. And so for me, as long as we are separated or selectively harmed by space, we can never achieve any of the other justices that we seek. And so it's really important to bring space to this conversation of what does it mean to create a just world. And in particular, I think when I start to look at that, I also look at this lens of healing, because I think oftentimes the harm that has been associated by the conditions of the past have actually created wounds. And so in order to understand how do we move forward, it's not just how do we create new buildings or new opportunities, but literally how do we heal those injustices that have happened before. And healing can seem like a sort of odd word to be using in this time, when I wouldn't even say we're out of a global pandemic, we're in whatever the stage of the apocalypse is right now. But over the last couple of years, we've actually seen these injustices writ large, from the killing of innocent Black men and women to thousands and millions, I would argue, who are living with food and housing insecurity, to the massive death that we have witnessed. And the reality, though, is that none of this stuff is actually new, right? I think so. It was so easy to associate it with the last couple of years when the world got quiet enough and slow enough for all of us to stop and listen and see. But this is actually something that has been happening for a really long time. And so this idea of how do we meet this moment, I think, is not just meeting what has been before us or what seems stark right now. And I would say that this could even be applied to this idea of the climate crisis, right? It seems really stark right now, but the reality is we're reacting to something that has been coming for a really long period of time. And it is always engaged not just the landscape, but the people as well. I like this quote that actually came out in response to stuff around the pandemic, but I think that for me, it really speaks to this idea of how these things that we are reacting to are actually persistent traumas. One of the requirements for healing is mourning. In order to mourn one's pain and suffering, the trauma itself has to be acknowledged. The trauma is not post, it is very much current. And so I think as we think about how do we move into this time, it's how do we move into an understanding that we're not responding to a thing that is episodic or that is just springing up right now. We're actually reacting to a thing that has been building for a long period of time. And how do we shift our response, whether we're talking about climate or whether we're talking about social issues? How do we encompass that large arc and encompass it from a frame that we're actually responding to a traumatic experience that needs to be approached and met with that same level of scale? So for me, that's shifting from this lens of how do we fix these issues that we're being presented to how do we heal these issues that are coming to us. And so what I wanted to do is just share 2 projects that I've been working on that kind of illustrate how I've been approaching that in the lens of practice. So this first project is actually one that just closed last fall after a decade of working on it. It's located in a neighborhood called Bayview Hunters Point, which is in the southeastern quadrant of San Francisco. It was historically a working class African American neighborhood, and it was also a perfect illustration of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. So this has one of the largest percentage of public housing in the city of San Francisco. It also had most of the city's industrial uses, including this power plant, which existed for almost a century, the naval shipyard that closed in the 70s, built and deconstructed nuclear ships, and one of the largest sewage treatment plants located near a residential neighborhood is in this neighborhood. It also has one of the lowest per capita income in San Francisco. As you know, we have a little bit of a housing crisis in San Francisco. So pre-pandemic, the median home price was $1.5 million in the city. The median income in this neighborhood was $63,000. So you can see that it was a place of massive disparity. But back in the late 90s, a group of community members, including the mothers living in the public housing on the hill above this, came together to fight for its closure. They were successful. The utility company closed the plant, tore it down, cleaned the soil, and then capped it with asphalt, because at the time they felt it was probably going to be about a decade before anything was able to be built there. We're now looking at closer to 2. But I was part of a team that was brought together to try and figure out what kind of uses could be put on that land in the short term, because when the plant was cleared, we're actually talking about 30 acres of asphalt, which is the equivalent of 30 football fields. So to leave that vacant for a decade was a little bit problematic. So we came together and actually said that if we were going to put uses on here, we needed to put stuff that actually responded to community benefit. And so we worked together with those mothers who lived on the hill, community organizations, to try and identify what kinds of programs could we bring here that would actually meet community needs and desires. And so that included everything from job training workshops to yoga days with kids, to an annual circus. And our centering was really like, how could we transform this site, which had been associated with grief and trauma, into a place that had been associated with joy. And so, over the 10 years that we had been operational, we had over 30,000 people come to this site and do something on it. We also were able to move forward with one permanent piece of redevelopment, which was the shoreline edge of the site, and so we turned it into a linear park. We did a pretty intense community engagement effort with it, and this was a really key thing because even though this community actually had a gorgeous spot right by the water, because of all the industrial uses, they had often been cut off from that water. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was use this as an opportunity to reconnect people to the landscape and to the water's edge. But also key to this was the importance of making sure that the social history of the neighborhood was also woven in, because one of the things that we heard as a fear of redevelopment was that people were going to be lost, that this was just an on-ramp to gentrification and cultural erasure. And so one of the things that we did was we actually created interpretive signage throughout that actually brought in the histories of the community, including quotes from people who had been involved in the fight to close the plant. But a pretty significant event that happened with this project was in 2017 when the utility company was finally ready to move forward with conversations about the future. They held a community meeting, and I think it could be best described as an unmitigated disaster. You can imagine your worst community meeting, and that's probably what gives you a perfect picture of what happened here. And a lot of it was because in spite of all of the things that we had done, people were really afraid that that still didn't matter, because if history repeated itself, it meant that people were going to be displaced and what they were going to see in the future was not going to represent them, and that the land was just going to be sold off to rich developers who were going to build condos that would sell for millions of dollars. And so for me, as I watched that, one of the things that I felt was really significant in understanding this conversation of like, how do we move forward in a place that creates opportunities for all, is that what we had not dealt with adequately in all of our work was this idea that associated with any change, and in particularly change in places where there has been a history of trauma, is that there is a lot of grief. And our processes traditionally don't hold space for grief. And so one of the things that we tried to do, building off of that, and then I've tried to move into my work, is how, as we are talking about what the future can be, do we hold space for grief? In this project, we actually accidentally had done that in the beginning. We partnered with StoryCorps when we first started working on the site to actually interview everybody who had been involved in fighting for the plant to come down, to understand what they wanted to see. Because when we did initial interviews, we heard that they felt that stories were being lost as people grew old or were naturally displaced out of the neighborhood. And so in those stories, there was actually a lot of grief that was expressed. And what we didn't do throughout the rest of the process was how do we create places, more places and opportunities to do that. So following that meeting, we actually partnered with Question Bridge, which is this national project that originally did interviews with thousands of Black males around the country and created these really interesting conversations. And so we brought them to the Bayview and did a year-long conversation about race and place and belonging. And that culminated in the original exhibition being shown on the site, but also like a day-long symposium that brought people together to have this conversation of what does it mean to belong to a place? What does it mean to hold place for my memory? And all the experiences that I had here. And so one of the things I do want to say, going back to this idea of climate and transforming, is that how do we think of all the histories that have been here? How do we think as things are changing, what are the griefs associated with that? And how, as we think about what can happen, do we create containers to be able to hold that, and that is part of how we look forward into the future. When we closed the project, we similarly tried to take that tact, and so we actually received a grant from the Kenneth Rainin Foundation to do a year-long conversation of what would an intentional close look like. I think oftentimes when there are these tactical urbanism or activation projects, when you're done, and you're gone. And we wanted to make sure that we actually were doing it with the same intentionality that we had tried to spearhead these conversations. So we did a series of conversations at various community events, trying to find out these same issues of belonging and place and how people connected to that. And then we actually used the linear park as a stage to get people to actually engage with the landscape. So what you see in the middle is an installation from a local artist that brought audience members to participate in an understanding of what does it mean to connect to the land. And then on the right was this amazing local girls dance group that really took over the landscape and brought their identity into that. And then, the other thing that I would say is that as we are supporting communities to determine the fate of the places in which they call home, it's really important to think about how are we giving them tools. So one of the things we wanted to do is just because we were leaving the project and the site, we didn't want to disconnect all of the things and all of the knowledge that had been gathered over the last 10 years. So we actually created what we called a pamphlet for action that was given out at the event that included summaries of all the data that we had collected over 10 years of what people wanted to see in the site. You'll see there are lovely kids drawings because one of the things we also do is engage kids into this conversation of what they want to see and collect that as data. And then on the right is a page that talks about, okay, this is all the land that is available. This is potentially what could happen. These are the people that you could go to. This is what they would be responsible for. And so basically it's like, how do we support people to be able to claim the sites that are in their neighborhood and actually determine the future of it? The second project is a little closer to here. Friendship Court is how I actually first became familiar with Charlottesville. I've been working on it since the beginning, which is 2015, 2016. Other than the residents, I'm probably the person who's been on it the longest, which is a bit strange. But for those of you who are not familiar, it's just a few blocks south of here. It sits on 11 acres. It currently is home to 150 families living in Section 8 housing, but it is slated for redevelopment. It has never been redeveloped in the 40-plus years that it has been in existence. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to create new homes for the families that live there. Now, if we were thinking about things in the context of fixing, we could look at the conditions at Friendship Court and immediately figure out, I as an architect can immediately figure out the things that I can do. This is what a typical interior of an apartment looks like: dark interiors, old decaying infrastructure. We can immediately know how to do that. Or the beautiful green space, which is a park-like experience but floods over anytime there's a little bit of rain. All of those things, I think, for those of us who are in the design disciplines, we can look at this and think, I know how to fix that. I know what to do around that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are creating a new place that actually supports the vibrancy of people or actually connects them intimately to their landscapes. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about in this idea of how are we doing transformation is how are we creating the full spectrum of things that support people to thrive. That justice isn't just about replacing with new, it's actually creating the conditions in which people can thrive. I'm going to give a little trigger warning in that the next slide actually includes a photo of 4th Street from August 2017. So if it is something that's going to be uncomfortable, I will let you know when I go to the slide after that, but I just wanted to give that warning before I go to it. Oh, sorry, no, the next slide doesn't include that. The next slide includes housing, or some of the things that, this is what the new Friendship Court is going to look like. And so, we could typically say that we've done our job if this was all that we create. And so now I am going to that sensitive slide. But I think the importance of this is that in order to understand what is actually going to support people thriving, we have to be more expansive in our thinking. Sunshine Mathone, the executive director of Piedmont Housing Alliance, which operates Friendship Court, has often said that if all we do is build housing, we're just helping the poor to be poor better. So this idea of how do we take in what we need to know to really create things that are about transformation and thriving actually exists within these slides. When I talk about this project beyond Charlottesville, many people will immediately go to 2017 and think, well, yes, of course, I can see how that engages, but the importance is there is a 250-year history of this intersection between race, place, and harm here. And that is what the residents know when we come and we start talking about transformation. So when I first landed on this project, people were like, oh, this is just going to be like Vinegar Hill. And so there, the displacement of black folks that happened in the 1960s. And so really that is a buzzword for transformation means that you're kicking me out and I am losing my home, and I'm going to wind up worse than where I was before. Or you can even go back to the days of slavery, right? Like some people at Friendship Court would refer to UVA as the plantation. So this is the long arc that we actually have to respond to when we are talking about transforming places, not just what we see immediately in front of us. So knowing that, we could pat ourselves on the back for saying we figured out how to do a phased development that will allow us to get into zero displacement and create all of these lovely homes. But really what we need to talk about is like, how are you creating places and connections that actually connect that longer arc of memory and that longer arc of grief and trauma? So for us, that has meant that actually what we do is we leverage development as a tool to center residents and create these other things that support them to be able to accomplish this place of thriving. So in collaboration with the residents, we sort of identified these spatial justice pillars that represent what they would like to see as part of an outcome of development. So that's everything from actually seeding generational wealth, to shared power, to cultural belonging and empathy, to healing and well-being. And out of these, there's a bunch of different things, some of them physical, like a health center, but others more ephemeral, like intentional community building. And so here you can see a sort of blow up of one of those pillars that actually gets into, these are all the things that would actually be required to create a place that is a place of thriving. We've done all of this in collaboration with a resident advisory committee, and it's been really important to see them as the clients of what we do. And so I think this idea of healing for me is central to when we are talking about how are we transforming places, we need to contain the spectrum of all these lives that have been lived and the spectrum of the places in which they are in. And it's about bringing those two things together. And that is how we do transformation that actually supports people to thrive. And if you see, we're here today to talk about climate justice, but I don't think that's divorced from any of the other justices that we seek. And really it's about thinking about them as an integrated basis that will actually allow us to create an opportunity where we seed what is best for all. And so our clients in this case are not just the natural landscape and all the beings within it, but I think also all of these people. Both of those actually are turning the idea of client on its head, right? Because I think typically our clients are the people who pay us, but I think actually we have to think of clients as the people and places that are impacted by any of our actions. And really, how do we bring together all of those things to create experiences in which people can thrive? I will close with a quote from Cornel West, which for me really gets at what I think at the end is the end result of the things that we're trying to create. Justice is what love looks like in public. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Can you all hear me? All right, good. I'm C.L. Bohannon, the Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture. And hopefully, the Climate Transformation Symposium will be a fruitful space for understanding how we can explore ways collective actions can be utilized to address social and environmental inequalities. In my time with you today, I will share a few guiding principles that have shaped the work in my landscape architecture studio that I taught last fall with a Black coastal community in the Panhandle of Florida. Let's get this right. So the first principle is community identified projects, and I want to open up the conversation with a quote from Kofi Boone from his article, Black Landscapes Matter. In that article, Kofi asked, what if landscapes were approached as a way to help invisible people and places to be seen? What if landscape processes were developed to help us all live with dignity? And what if, through our continued and shared commitment to building together a more just society, we resisted the forces that will pull us apart and instead engage in work with the intent of being connected? So now I want to take you on a trip. I want you to visualize with me and take a trip to the Panhandle of Florida. Unlike with my students, we rode on a bus for about 18 hours, so we're going to take a much shorter trip here. Some of them are in here, so I want to give them a shout out for that. But just visualize for a moment. Morning comes gently to Apalachicola. Oyster boats and shrimp boats begin their daily pilgrimages as the sun rises on the Florida coast. The lights twinkle on its fishing village, its residents ready for another day in an unspoiled paradise. If you ever wondered if such a place exists, yes, it does. Old Florida lives here. This was according to Southern Living magazine. Here's the reality, though. In 2021, the newly revitalized Apalachicola, Florida, also known as Appalach, a coastal panhandle city with about 2,500 residents and the seat of Franklin County, features artisanal shops, seafood restaurants, and historical plaques. But the official Old Florida narrative omits the history of the African American population of the city and the broader region. Historic sites continue this erasure, even to the point where a marker outside of a restored cotton warehouse in downtown states that Apalachicola was once the largest cotton port in the South. Yet, no mention is made of the enslaved population that not only produced the crop during produced the crop during the cotton boom of the 1830s. Here I bring attention that stories play an important role in the development and survival of cultures. Stories also provide significant information about language, history, and the environment. In all forms, though, stories and histories are connected in our daily lives and contribute to the makeup of society, from entire cities to local communities. Historical practices in the marginalization of Black communities in planning and design that shape the very spatial and economic and environmental conditions have proven challenging to their survival. In many cases, these historical practices have included practices of conflict, inequality, discrimination, and displacement. So at this critical moment of social and ecological change, it is our responsibility to disrupt these practices through our work, to reflect the values and needs of marginalized communities, and also promote a shift in how we work with communities in ways that our projects are conceptualized and actualized. These projects should come from the community to address self-identified issues. So to situate my work in community, but also as a pedagogical lens in the classroom, I utilize this framework that I developed called RP3, which is basically real people, real problems, and real projects, which incorporates a deeper learning through methods of community mapping, storytelling that build capacity for effective community engagement and social change. Principle 2, we need to be grounded in place. So being grounded in place is critical to my approach to community engagement. In this particular project with the students, they were asked to create a regional atlas of uneven geographies as a means of studying and presenting both essential information about a place and critical understandings of the complex evolution, structure, culture, and natural systems of the landscape of the Gulf and the Panhandle. This reflective practice and exercise in mapping the interwoven characteristics of this place and its people allow for our studio to understand how the history of the Forgotten Coast has shaped its current challenges and opportunities. This is an image from the work from the studio. Apalachicola will experience a profound change in its natural landscape in the coming decade. North of Appalach, a 100 square mile tract of forested wetland will wither in the next 10 years, becoming a ghost forest that will gradually be swallowed by the rising sea. This area will be one of the largest ghost forests in the state of Florida, offering an unmistakable warning of the region's vulnerability to climate change. Recent climatic changes have resulted in the salinization of forest soils, causing tree die-off and saltwater marsh encroachment that appears as a skeleton of the former forest, hence the term ghost forest there. Without a coastal vegetative barrier, inland communities are more vulnerable to hurricanes, storm surges, and flooding at a time when storm intensity is increasing. In addition to this, also in Appalach, approximately 1,400 Africans were brought through Apalachicola and moved up the Apalachicola River to various plantations in the area. Can't talk about climate change without talking about enslaved, or slavery, I'll just say it that way. So in Apalachicola, the house of Thomas Ormond still stands along the eastern edge of the Hill community. This is a place that they see every day. And it's a steadfast reminder of people's desire and commitment to creating community and building a sense of place together, even through the brutality of slavery and now under the pressures of climate change. In addition, as we know, in Apalachicola, it's like the oyster capital of the U.S. The decline of the fishing industry has also played into some of the current conditions. So the low-lying wetlands of the Chattahoochee Delta, alongside the densely arborist and subsequently preserved Apalachicola National Forest, ensure commercial development is kept to a minimum. Then, students really start to unpack and understand how deeply the region's economic economy is shaped by its current geography. And the image to my left, I guess to your right, start looking at fishing, the industry within itself. So by aligning the most common fish caught seasonally with a graph of a monthly minimum and maximum water temperatures, you start to get a fuller picture of how fishing drives the region, both economically and culturally there. And then we start linking, about culture assets. We firmly believe that every community has assets that could be utilized in any kind of engagement or community development project that can be used to move the community forward. And so this particular image shows vacancy, rates of vacancy within the community, but also how those lots that seem vacant as a kind of a cursory reading also are imbued with community memories and identity through that. So what happens when you actually have a conversation with someone about the landscape in which they live? How does that then start to change the way we approach landscape development? Hoping this thing works. Yeah, so the students developed a series of community asset mapping projects. This is one that will be utilized to understand as a starting point to have collective conversations at the block level about people's memories through the streets that they experience on a daily basis, basically. The next principle, our position in history. Principle 3 is to understand, we're at a critical moment in history and in the academy in terms of how we work with communities. We definitely have to turn away from working on communities. Simply stated, and I teach this in the studio and in my lab, no community nor its people should be used as a backdrop or prop for work that's done in the name of research, outreach, or engagement. Central to the work here is the knowledge that's already in place. Local knowledge is really important for these projects to be successful. And so we were intentional in partnering with Florida A&M University, which is one of the, outside of Florida State, one of the most important universities in the panhandle of Florida, particularly to this community, multi-generational graduates that come from Apalachicola, that graduate from Florida A&M. But also we partnered with local educators, artists, and community organizers. But also we had to acknowledge our role coming from UVA in this project. And so our role was not to come in and to take over, but rather to center the voices of the community at every stage of the project. And this is what I like to talk about a lot. I like to disrupt. So a disruptive pedagogy. What does that mean to actually allow our students within this process to slow down, to think about what they're doing, also in some cases make them uncomfortable because they've been so shaped through design education to be efficient, to be, in my case, I personally think to be machines. We have to slow down. We have to take that away. You can only move at the speed of trust when we do engagement work. And also asking a simple question, and I'll show some of the images here, asking students how do they center their own voices in the work that they're doing. What does community mean to them? What does place mean to them? But also to start to getting at the values that we need our graduates to actually have if we're going to do this work and do it in a meaningful way to be agents of change. And so that's where this piece of framework for cultivating shared ethics for community-engaged pedagogy, where we can reflect where we've been, we can articulate a vision for the future, and then we can actually have the praxis to do the work. And we actually went through this process in the studio. The first thing I asked the students to do before we even went in that 18-hour bus ride to Apalachicola is to actually create their own deep map, their own understanding. If you're going to be asked to deal with someone else's story or to listen, and you haven't unpacked your own story or listened to your own ways of being, how can you do that work? And so the students were asked to create this kind of palimpsestic deep map around 3 lenses, basically: community, people, and place, and what that meant to them. And they were able to develop an interview protocol and it took like 3 weeks to actually do this project. But they were able to create these maps that were really about them before we were able to go down to Apalachicola and work with the stories of others to be able to handle that. The next principle, which is also, I think all of these are really important, but sustained engagement. So central to this is, how community engagement projects are framed and co-developed, but also how the work is carried out during the semester. There's a thing of semester time versus real time. What happens when the semester's done? And in terms of, do you go back to the community? How do you invite community members in to participate on reviews? We have to get beyond having these kind of parachute one-off projects where we just come in, we feel great, everyone has these happy-go-lucky things, and we disappear. That does more harm. So in February, we actually went back as part of the African American History Festival in Apalachicola to actually present the work that came out of the studio from the conversations that we had with the community there, in addition to inviting members of the Mellon team to actually participate in reviews in December. And so I'll finish with this because I'm all about engaged pedagogy and what's important for the learning that happens out of that. And I do think there are 6 ways in which a community engaged pedagogy supports student learning. And remember, that's not just students in class. I think we're all students in this process in terms of what we do here. So integration, participating in the courses, both learners and community members, we were able to expose people, particularly in this case students, to multiple viewpoints and perspectives and priorities. The power of reflection, creatively or critically reflecting on the learning experiences, which allow students to form beliefs, values, and opinions, and hopefully positive habits of practice. Also contextualizing the work, having an opportunity to access community knowledge and utilize their own knowledge to tackle the complexities of society. Also realizing that the work is asset-based, and so it allows students that are in these processes to learn how to identify and develop unique qualities about a community. Not everything needs to be a tabula rasa. And also reciprocity, providing time, talent, and academic capital to grow as design researchers, but also it's important to acknowledge the time that community members invest in these engaged processes to accomplish goals and working with students. And then, as always, you want this work to be something that lives beyond when our students graduate from the A school and leave grounds and get out into society, that this is kind of a lifelong habit of practice, way of being a designer, a planner, or just a citizen at the most basic level, in terms of how their work can be transformative and how the knowledge that is gained while engaging with the community can build relationships, solve problems, and also position them to develop a sense of community, gain self-awareness, and enhance civic and community responsibility. Thank you.
I'm not sure. Am I that's okay, and I pointed here? Just, okay. Trying to get oriented. Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Dankla-Cobb, and I'm happy to be here with you. Thank you all for being here. I'm director of a small but mighty group of people at the School of Architecture called the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, and glad to see a couple of our student research assistants here today and who've actually worked on some of this. So I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been doing since 2015 called The Raft. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but I'm really here with an idea that our team sort of had an aha moment over the last year, which may seem obvious to you all once we say it, and maybe you've already had this idea too, but I'm testing it out, really, which is that there is a tragedy of the climate resilience commons. And what is that? Well, so some of you, I'm not assuming, I know all the planning students understand what the commons are. I'm not assuming others here do. So just historically, you know, the commons has been framed as a broad set of resources, natural, cultural, that are shared by many people. And so we often think about it in terms of the landscape. However, today, I really feel like what we have learned is that the commons is way more complex. And it includes human resources. We don't often think about that. We don't think about the communication networks and the community services as part of the important commons that we need to be thinking about. So, and that includes everything that we need. Education, housing, healthcare, all of that. And so we have this, so commons, and then resilience. There's this punching bag version of resilience. I'm not sure I totally buy into it, but it's what's often thought about, that resilience is the ability to recover to a baseline after a shock or a stress. So the question is, who's deciding what that baseline is? Is it the best that we can be? Who's being excluded from that baseline? Who has never had access to what some may be defining as that baseline? Is the baseline good enough for a future of survival of this species? What if the baseline itself starts changing? Oh my gosh. And so this idea that climate equity has to mean equitable resilience, has to mean that the community is in the driver's seat. And so where's the tragedy coming in? Well, we think about the different legs of the resilience stool that are often thought about: economic resilience, we think about environmental resilience, and we think about social resilience. I know from my work, which is really very much probably, 75% here in Virginia and 25% elsewhere in the nation, and some of our work with the Institute is international, is for the most part, most of the money is focused very much on environmental infrastructure resilience, some of it on economic resilience, and almost none of it, although some of it we're starting to see changes, but almost none of it really on social resilience. And so what does this mean? What we had this aha moment. Now, understand we've been doing this project since 2015, so we might be called slow learners, but we have come to this idea that, really resilience as a concept is like the commons, that when all are in charge, basically none are in charge, and that when people and organizations have to seek resilience individually, which is what we've been seeing happening in these communities, then people are left out, and climate inequity results. Needs are not addressed. And so the reason why this happens is because of follow the money. The money is going towards infrastructure, it's going towards mostly infrastructure, some towards economic resilience. And so where are the people? Where are the people in this? And so it's a very narrow approach. So I love this little cartoon that I sort of put together from different places. But basically, the overburdened, disproportionately impacted communities means that they have to follow the money. So the local governments are now following the money as well, right? Even in these what would be called under-resourced communities, overburdened communities. So all these other aspects of resilience of, do people have transportation to get out of the community if something happens? Do they have child care? What about health care? Can they get to their medicine? These are things that are not really being thought about at this level of, top-down funding, trickle-down funding. So this project that I've referred to, called the RAFT, comes from an acronym that we kind of pieced together called Resilience Feasibility Adaptation Tool. A lot of what people have said already have just rung so many bells of what we've experienced. We started in 2015. And since then, we've worked with 24 localities, and we're about ready to start in another region that will add another 5. But basically, the goal behind this project from the beginning was brought to us by communities, by them coming to us when we held a meeting down at William and Mary with a whole bunch of people saying, what is it? All these universities have descended on the coast, all these studies, all these models, what is it you really need? And they said, we can't really translate all of this stuff to on the ground. Local governments don't have the wherewithal to do that. And so we put our heads together with them. We did a fair amount of research led by our students on different approaches, looking at all of the different scorecards across the country, et cetera. Long story short is we ended up with an 18-month process that has a quantitative assessment, a qualitative assessment, all involving the community, leading to a community workshop, community in the driver's seat, identifying one-year priorities. And that's not enough, because even then we found out that the community wasn't going to be able to do it, that they needed help. They needed coordination, facilitation help, networking help. They needed, all of that they don't have resources for. And so we put this together, providing this at no cost to the locality. This is a team across 3 universities, which is pretty unusual, and unusual that 3 universities have stayed together for so long. So we're very proud of this, and I want to give a shout out to Sophie and Sarah, who are student research associates here, who've been working with IEN and have, one has worked deeply on this and one knows a lot about it. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned? We've learned, we did a research, we did a study funded by the Environmental Resilience Institute, thank you very much, on the impacts of COVID on resilience. And what we found was that it's totally relevant. What happened with COVID is totally relevant. What happened with COVID is totally relevant to climate resilience. We found that networking, that those communities that did really well were already well networked, and that it needs to be networked across community service organizations for a successful response to impacts. That it's not on the climate, we also learned that climate resilience is not on the radar of most of these service organizations because they've got their hands full with just providing the services to their people. But once they knew about what was going to be happening, they were all in. What do we do? How do we participate? And one of the things also, not a surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, is that the historical inequities that have been perpetrated by policies and laws through a very long time, 100 or more years, actually several hundred years if we really go back to the history of slavery in this country, is they are very present in COVID, they're very present in climate resilience. So what are some of the things that play out in terms of the social resilience? Here's just some of the things that we find are critical for resilience. We found libraries, for example, are absolutely critical to have at the table. Emergency managers, of course, but youth organizations, food banks, all of elderly service providers, local transportation providers, all of that. So the conditions that worsen, what are the things that make it harder for those who are already vulnerable? Already vulnerable. Look at all of these things. The list, this is not a complete list of all of the things that make it harder for people who are already having difficulty, and then something happens, a hurricane or tornado, whatever it might be. And we also now have earthquakes coming more. So whatever it is, all of these things make it worse for people. And nobody, the tragedy of the Resilience Commons is that there's nobody coordinating this. Nobody's really paying attention to this. So what we found, and the aha moment, was that it really does need a focused effort. That's what the RAFT has done. Our project has provided this sort of focal point of bringing in the whole community, right? And so this, one of the things I think I said this, so I'm going to move on. So the social elements, what we found is that the whole community approach is essential. The whole community basic needs around food, housing, shelter actually start rising to the top when you ask people what their resilience priorities are, and you have a broader set of people at the table. All of a sudden, the infrastructure stuff starts going down to the bottom, and these other things start rising to the top in terms of this is what we need to work on. Physical and mental health, computer access. We need broadband access, right? How do we make this possible? So the other thing that we have found, which is really phenomenal, thanks to the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund in the Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck, we've been fortunate to have $150,000 to give out in mini grants, and we have successfully awarded these to local organizations, $5,000 to $10,000, some at $25,000, and we found unbelievable. Here were their priorities. This is where they needed the money, and look, food is huge, and shelter and waste, emergency rehousing, vouchers for emergency housing, septic pump outs, other things like helping the local fire departments give training. Very interesting. We've had discussions around the history and the meaning of history. This plays out. The Rosenwald School needs help. This is part of identity. When you are in the midst of massive change and massive transformation, retaining identity is huge. And so, yes, we said this is valid for a climate resilience, that you need to preserve this history. I'm paying attention to my time here. Yep. Okay, so resilience, my final lessons, resilience, as I said, has to be a community-wide discussion. It takes time. You can't just come in. It is an issue of trust and building trust. And so the qualitative interviews and focus groups that we do is part of building trust. And who are you up there at UVA? Like, what are you doing here? This is part of it. I'm moving on, and this is, I think, my final slide, that it's not enough to just invite people to the table. We need to meet people where they are. We need to build in time for building relationships. We need to work within the existing structures, so using community resource councils and their networks, for example, and libraries, for example, and their networks. And one of the biggest lessons most recently is, if we can, as a university, if we have the capacity to ask and to build funding in for local organizations to get funding to do the projects that they can do to build their capacity to help their own resilience, we should do it. They're eager for it. They're ready. They're standing willing. We should I think that's part of our obligation to start thinking about that, bringing money for them to their table. Thank you. I think that's it.
Okay. Awesome. Good morning. This is where you get to talk. Good morning. Yeah, it felt good, didn't it? Say something. I am Barbara Brown Wilson. I am so honored to be able to speak after such an amazing set of folks. I feel like I'm able to draw on what Liz and CL and Tanya said so that I can start with a little bit more geeky how we get these projects done at the minutia level, just to add that in. I will say that I'm talking about a project that's actually directed by Dr. Karen McGlathery on the third row here, so she may want to get up and correct me on a few things. She's really my boss on this project, so it's fun to be sharing in this work with her. Thank you for being here. And also, it draws directly on the amazing long-term partnership that Tanya just described with ODU and William and Mary. So, Karen's been working for 30 years on the Eastern Shore. I mean, well, the thing you represent, there are entities with long-term relationships that we are building off of. My amazing PhD student colleague Lincoln Lewis just last night developed, based on Jenny Rogan, who's, there on the fourth row, some work to graph out a timeline. It didn't make it into these slides because they were due last week. But anyway, the work is about weaving together a lot of trust and a lot of assets. So I'll try to describe a little bit more of like, how does that look in one project? So we were lucky enough to get a $5 million 5-year grant for a climate equity focused project that brings in all of these assets, but also draws from the amazing assets already on the Eastern Shore of Virginia to really work, for 5 years in community. And the goal of the project is really to think about, to center equity, climate equity and racial equity as a part of that, to Liz's slides earlier, to create a community-driven decision support tool that's very data-rich and brings in both social and economic data, but also ecological data, both historic and future-facing. So really trying to help in creating a platform, a social and data platform for equitable governance and good decision-making on the Eastern Shore. It is a mostly rural place, so it is a very different, I'm part of the Equity Center, and we've built a lot of local interactive decision support tools for the local community here in Charlottesville, so it's very different and wonderful to be working in a place that's two more rural counties and kind of learning alongside those actors. We have kind of two primary objectives in the project. One is really more about the building of a social infrastructure that is not only inclusive of the wonderful existing local leadership, both kind of local from the faith-based community and local from the leading of the YMCA, and then also government officials and others. And then also thinking together with that social infrastructure and what language do we use, what data do we draw from to make better decisions. So building out, co-creating a climate equity atlas that allows us to think both historically back into this, the 1600s and into the future together, because all those things matter. We are in year 2. So you'll see there's a lot of in process in the moment. We have built a team, and I'll describe that a little bit further in the future slides, but we are also looking towards stewardship and sustainability. So there's a lot about this tool that is very dynamic and very wonderful and pretty high tech in terms of thinking about coastal dynamics and modeling, but it also needs to be something that can be stewarded long term by the local actors and stakeholders that are really high capacity in many ways, but want technology they can use and update themselves. So figuring out how to right size all of that work so that we bring in all of the local and technical knowledge in a way that can be sustained with humility. So the actor network is really focused on the local community and their assets. We have heard time and again through many deliberative processes that there's several things that are like major concerns, but also that there's a love of this place that ties everyone together. And so really centering, as CL was saying, the assets of the Eastern Shore is a huge part of the work. Our Community Advisory Committee is drawing in both lived expertise of those disproportionately impacted by climate change on the Eastern Shore. So there's a large percentage of people of color and low-income people, but also those representing larger social service organizations that can take in and build that adaptive capacity to help people both in extreme climate events, but also just every day with all the things Tanya was just mentioning that are super important. And then the science team, it's been very beautiful to work with a very large, very accomplished set of engineers, environmental scientists, and the Biocomplexity Institute, a whole bunch of folks from across the state that make up UVA in a way that's really about the needs, concerns, and vision of the local community. So everybody's been really committed to doing this iterative work together. It's been a lot of fun so far. So Karen Downing and Andre Elliott are the two community PIs, and they are at every leadership meeting, at least one of them. They wanted to share the post because they're both really busy people. Karen Downing is a local pastor and has been long an advocate through Virginia Organizing and other places for climate justice. And Andre Elliott is the head of the YMCAs, which is a huge local asset, very committed to both youth and also both of them to racial equity. So they were doing work in the summer of 2020 that really was new as far as we understood it. Cora is an amazing partner here too, who works with Karen on the Eastern Shore. And she had said, the conversations that are being held over Zoom in pretty complex ways during the pandemic in the summer of 2020 are really, really exciting. We're developing new skills as a community to talk about racial equity, and it's a really important issue. So we went humbly to Karen and Andre and said, hi, can we help you with what you're doing? We're really inspired. And they said, yes, we think we can benefit from your help. So then we mapped out with them who are the different stakeholders, who are the different community groups that help each other and help specifically low-income and people of color on the Eastern Shore, and invited them to participate in what became the Community Advisory Committee that meets quarterly and animates a lot of our public-facing work. We've heard consistently that saltwater intrusion has a big role that it plays in both agricultural impacts in the local economy and those non-human actors we were hearing about earlier, but also in the quality of the water supply. And then both coastal and inland flooding have different ways that they show up impacting the local community. We've heard from the very beginning that Karen and Andre both know some buses, even on sunny days, can't get where they need to get to pick up kids. And they want to know, what's that look like? How do we make sure that frontline workers can always get to their job or are accommodated when, the flooding makes it to where they can't be where they need to be? Karen keeps telling us, we just want to know how climate change is going to impact our lives. Are we going to be able to be mobile across space and time with each other, to stay connected? What does it look like? How does this matter in our daily lives? So it's been really fun to work with satellite imagery specialists and engineers, understanding that they can look at land use change for the past 40 years. And even though the community said those past 40 years are great, but we're really talking 1660, so let's keep learning together. But also, what meaning can we make together when we think about both local and sort of technical knowledge, and the relationships and mapping out those relationships from both a very qualitative and quantitative aspect has been important and exciting for our project. We held our first big public meeting. We've been, again, talking for several years, building up the we, that is both the science and local community through the Community Advisory Committee, but we held our first big public meeting after going and having pre-meetings and presentations with all the boards of supervisors of the local councils and a few other key groups, and invited people to give us their feedback on 8 kind of key questions that kept coming up for us. We wanted to learn in tandem with folks, and so we tried to stay very humble in terms of not giving big presentations. And about 80 people showed up on a kind of rainy day, which we thought was a big success. We got a lot of the people that are already committed to this work, but also in government, and those are important voices to kind of allow you to continue, especially when you're talking about racial justice, which is a thing that many are still developing their skills around. So we got this sort of blessing to now go and have smaller conversations with the most impacted groups, which are not going to come on a Monday to your public meeting at the community college, but they will maybe show up for one-on-one discussions and focus groups to talk about what they need. So now we get to switch into a phase that's much more focused on meeting people where they are. We're being invited to churches. We're being invited to oyster roasts. We're being invited into summer camps and science fairs. And it's a whole different type of discussion now that trust has been built across the Community Advisory Committee. They're letting us know that actually people don't want to talk in groups about their septic systems failures. That is a point of privacy. It is important, and they do want to talk about it, but they want maybe a one-on-one conversation, right? So really tooling what people feel innately, concerned about, but also which types of venues to learn with them collectively and respectfully. And so we're just getting started on the real kind of meaningful work that existing data can't tell us, but it's really exciting to do it with this group. Thank you.
All right. So again, happy to be here. My name is Bev Wilson. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning. Much of the work that I've done to date in this arena has focused on heat and heat exposure. So from mapping social vulnerability to making the argument that heat exposure is an example of environmental inequity and should be understood and approached through the lens of equity planning, to most recently engaging youth in questions of heat resilience planning and challenging them to think about why certain spaces feel warmer or cooler in their neighborhoods, and then also empowering them to and asking them to think about specific strategies that could be implemented or that they would like to see to help mitigate some of those impacts. So recently I've pivoted a bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that focuses instead on flood resilience and flooding. And so specifically, I'm going to focus on funding. And one of the overarching themes that I'm going to come back to is that funding and the way that we fund this kind of work needs to be transformed. So there's a need for transformation in this arena in particular. And so the image that you see here on the left is from last July. There was pretty significant flooding in Buchanan County, which is in the far southwest corner of Virginia. There are several issues that make Southwest Virginia an area of concern in terms of flooding. One of those is the mountainous topography, and another is obviously the shifting rainfall patterns that come along with climate change. One of the things that I wanted to mention here and sort of posit or to lay out as part of building this argument is that local actors have the knowledge and the relationships and the insights that they need to do this work. But one of the primary things that they need is sometimes they need technical assistance, but most of the time what they need is financial resources. And so thinking about ways to better connect local actors to financial resources that tend to reside at the state and federal levels, and then also sometimes with technical assistance is really important. I should go backwards. So on the right-hand side here is an image, and this is taken last semester. These are students that some of you might recognize who were working on an applied project. That's the town manager for Danville, who's so Danville is in the process of a rather significant floodplain buyout process right now. And so again, that is, I think, emblematic of the need to connect local actors with financial resources at the state and federal level, whether it's for this kind of property acquisition or if it's more proactive resilience planning ahead of time. And so again, the overarching argument is that the way that we fund this work, particularly with respect to flooding, needs to be reimagined. So the graphic here on the left-hand side is a schematic of how, in the past, up until relatively recently, we've approached funding this kind of work with respect to flooding. And so there's an event, there's a disaster, and local government is the first mover in terms of assessing damage and deciding whether there are enough resources to deal with the issues on the ground. If the scale and the extent of the flood damage exceeds local resources, which if we're talking about under-resourced communities that Tanya alluded to earlier, if we're talking about many, if not all of the localities in the southwestern region, that the project that I'm going to talk about in just a second, usually that threshold is going to be exceeded, in which case, and a call will go out to the state for additional resources to support that work. And then if it's a very large event, then that might even cascade up to the federal level in terms of a presidential emergency or disaster declaration. And so one of the issues with this is that if you can see in the lower right-hand corner, federal assistance in the past has been tied to this disaster declaration process. And the hazard mitigation assistance that you see there has been the primary vehicle through which the kind of resilience planning that we've been talking about and that we would all like to see has been awarded. So what needs to happen, what needs to continue to happen is decoupling the kind of proactive planning and preparedness from this presidential declaration process that is by definition after the fact. And so I should say there has been some progress in doing that. And so I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about a specific project that I've been involved with. Sarah, who's here, and Tanya have been part of the team here. So enter the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund. So this particular project aims to reduce flood risk, specifically in areas where there's been recurrent flooding. And so this particular project focuses, as I said, in Southwest Virginia. So 3 counties, Lee County, Scott County, Wise County, the city of Norton, and then also five towns. And so So one of the interesting things about this pot of money is that at least 25% of the funds have to be spent in low-income communities, which is, I think, clearly in line with the calls for greater attention to equity that we've heard from our speakers so far. And then it also prioritizes nature-based solutions, which aligns with the focus on environmental sustainability. But this particular program requires, among other things, a DCR-approved resilience plan in order to access those state funds, which sets up a need for these localities to meet these administrative hurdles or thresholds, or to clear those hurdles. And so this image here is of a manufacturing facility that's located in Scott County. You can see that part of it is in a floodplain. And so we have these tensions between public health and safety, environmental sustainability, but also economic base. And so this particular project focuses on questions like these. How do we strengthen capacity for flood resilience planning, particularly in under-resourced communities? I should say that our team has worked with another team here at UVA from environmental engineering. Much of the work is focused on taking stock of what exists in terms of the regulatory framework, looking at the land use controls that exist from zoning and floodplain ordinances to comprehensive planning, taking an inventory of stakeholders that are active or should be at the table moving forward, and then coming up with basically a workflow and a framework that can be replicated and can be used elsewhere. And so in terms of things that I've learned or conclusions that I've come to, so one of the assumptions that's inherent in programs like the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is that planning works and can work in the same way in Big Stone Gap as it works in Alexandria or as it works in Henrico County, which is not realistic. So how can we expect under-resourced communities to quickly produce these kinds of robust resilience plans that are going to pass muster, in terms of administrative review, to access these funds, to do the on-the-ground work of implementing projects that reduce flood risk moving forward? And so universities, in many cases, serve as an important intermediary. And this is not new. There's been a lot of allusions to the need for humility, to the need for collaboration. But one of the things that I have personally taken away from this project is that there is a need to have conversations at the outset and then ongoing conversations among the stakeholders, particularly with respect to intermediaries like universities, in terms of the agenda, in terms of the timeline, in terms of the expected outcomes. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a disconnect in terms of the expectations for the time frame. So we went from a 9-month project to a 16-month project. Part of that reflects different priorities and different requirements that the participants have. So for example, IRB process that university researchers must go through adds or can add significant time to these kinds of partnerships. And in terms of lessons learned for me, there's no substitute for direct engagement, for sustained engagement, intercept surveys, and there's competing imperatives in terms of getting these projects done in a timely fashion so that localities can access these funds versus universities and university partners being able to basically come away with some sort of research projects. And I should also say that one of our master's students, who's here right now, has done similar work as part of a thesis looking at another type of intermediary, so consulting firms. So this question of how do we connect those who are doing this work on the ground with the resources, whether it's financial resources or technical know-how and insights, is, I think, a really great question. And how can we do that better? So there's a need for sustained engagement with communities, but there's also a need for sustained engagement with climate more generally. So as we all know, climate change has been politicized. So one of the things that we bumped up against in this particular project was the extent to which we could use terms like equity, terms like climate change when engaging with the public around this project. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is, are there ways that we can separate this kind of work from politics and perhaps even insulate it from political cycles? We've seen here in Virginia, with the change in administration in Richmond, the political pendulum has swung. Perhaps some of you have heard about the governor's efforts to remove our state from RGGI. It just so happens that the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is where the original funding for this community flood preparedness fund came from. And so moving forward, we have a situation where localities in Southwest Virginia have invested over a year. They've invested their own resources and time, and it's unclear whether those funds are going to be available or are going to be available in the same way moving forward. There's been discussions about transitioning at least part of this to a revolving loans fund as opposed to a grant fund, and the stipulation that 25% of those funds be used and spent on projects on the ground in low-income communities seems to have disappeared. And then this is my last slide. There are limits to climate resilience, climate adaptation, certainly under the models that we currently have in place for funding this work. So for example, you may have heard about the National Flood Insurance Program and the fact that it's about $20 billion in debt. So it is not solvent. That is going to have to be reckoned with shortly, in the near future. One of the things that's been done is there's been some revisions to the way that flood risk and flood insurance premiums are being assessed. One of the less desirable outcomes is that we're seeing fewer people purchasing flood insurance. And so moving forward, we have to deal with the fact there's simply not enough money to make everyone whole. If moving forward in the context of a warming planet, we're going to have more of these Buchanan-style events. And at some point, it becomes irrational putting ourselves in the position of an individual property owner to purchase something like flood insurance. And what does that mean for resilience? Managed retreat is complex. It's emotional. I guess there's often tensions with place attachment and with meaning that has been inscribed in particular locations. And then how long can we expect to wait for buyout money at all? There's a study that was published that found that a typical floodplain buyout takes over 5 years, which does not, again, align with decision-making timelines for individuals. And so to close, I would just reiterate that at the local scale, we have actors who are doing this work, who have the knowledge and the relationships to do this work. We need to think about ways to better connect them with resources and with technical know-how and assistance to navigate this framework. We also need to think about ways to more efficiently get those resources in the hands of people who know how to use them. And I'm looking at my timer and realizing that I need to stop here. Thank you.